Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is our third video on the LogicApp topic. In our previous two videos, we have discussed what is LogicApp as an integration service, what it offers, what are the different type of LogicApps available with Azure, how do you create a standard and the consumption tier LogicApp, how do you define the LogicApp with the help of Azure portal, and we have also discussed the detailed walkthrough of the LogicApp from the Azure portal dashboard view. In this particular section, we are going to discuss about the workflows of the LogicApp. What is a workflow in LogicApp? How do you define the workflow in LogicApp? We'll start with very simplest workflow, and then later in the other videos, we'll define some of the complex scenarios with the workflow. So this is a getting started scenario with workflow where you can define your own visual flow to resolve a business case with the help of LogicApp. This is a full practical demonstration video. I hope you enjoy that. Hi, this is Rakesh Suryavanshi and you're watching Be a Learner. For the demonstration, I have logged into Azure portal, and as you can see that I have these many number of resources in my Azure portal where we have the app service plan, the log analytics resource, and the more specifically the LogicApp, which we will be using. And this time for the demonstration, we have created a LogicApp as a standard tier because we would like to have a individual workflow created within the LogicApp, which is only possible through the standard type of LogicApp. So let's open a view of the LogicApp and create our workflow right from there. I'll click on the LogicApp. Here you have the workflow section. You can click on the workflows. There you have the option to define your new workflow. If I click on add, this will open a window at the right side where you can define the name of the workflow. By default, I'll give a name of the workflow as workflow. Next, you have to define or choose a type of workflow. With the workflow in LogicApp standard type, you have two different type of workflow. State is one of them is the stateful and the other one is stateless. Stateful, as it is given in the description, it is highly optimized for the reliability, ideal for process the business transaction data. So what it does is when the LogicApp runs with the help of stateful, it uses the storage account as a backend to store all the sequential run or the workflow run states. It stores the overall state of the workflow which it has performed during a single run and stored the entire flow into a storage account, so that if you have a requirement to collect the log or to traverse the data of the workflow, it stores the entire persistent storage into the storage account. So this is one of the most recommended reliable way to use in case if you are working on highly scalable or reliable business process implementation. Whereas the other option, which is a stateless option, is optimized for the low latency run and ideal for the request response processing type. So if you have a workflow which are not performing a high volume of data processing, which is quick and easy to run, for example, in terms of the time process, if stateful or stateless workflows are very useful. Let's take an example. If it just required to process on a low amount of data or very short messages for the processes which it runs on the small amount of data. We'll go into the details of the comparison of what is available with the stateful and what is available with the stateless later in the video, or maybe in some other videos in future. But for now, I'll be creating a stateful workflow for this particular demonstration. So I'll be choosing the stateful option as the state type. Let's click on create buttons to create a workflow that will create a new workflow within our LogicApp. As you can see that I do have option to create multiple workflows, so I can click on add again and define another workflow. I can say another workflow, and then again I can choose the stateful type as well, and that will create another workflow. So I got a two different workflow within the same LogicApp, which is only possible with the help of standard LogicApp. and it cannot be possible, of course, with the consumption based logic app. So let's go to our very first workflows. I'll open that, and that will open a designer for my logic app. If you look at the dashboard or the overview section of this particular workflow, here I got the status of the workflow, which is enabled by default. Of course, I can disable it by clicking on the disable button. And then you have got the workflow URL, trigger type, which it is not defined yet. There is no workflow URL is also defined because I do not have the designer yet defined at the moment. The health status is healthy right now, as you can see here. And then it is connected to the application inside, of course, to fetch or to log any kind of incoming outgoing data. Now with the developer section, you got two options. One is the code view, where you can define your workflow in form of JSON. So if you are expert on the JSON, you can define or write your workflow as in JSON code directly here as in the code section, which I can see that it is in the editable mode. This is our default schema content which is given for the logic app, where you have got 4 different sections. Of course, the definition section, inside that you have the schema definition, and then you have the 4 different section. One is the action type, the content version, which is the workflow version type, and then you have the outputs and the different triggers. And of course, you have the kind is in this stateful, which we have chosen while creating this particular workflow type. Now next you have the design section, where of course we are interested in. And in our very first videos, we have mentioned that to define the logic app workflow, you have to define the trigger type, or you have to mention what kind of a trigger this particular logic app should act on. So the trigger could be HTTP trigger or time-based trigger, or it could be on an event. For example, when a file created on SFTP location or a storage blob location, or a message arrives at the service bus location. So any kind of a event or the data which you want to act on, the data process which you want your logic app to act, that is what the trigger type you can define. So for the simplest demonstration, or for this particular demonstration, I'll be using a time-based trigger event for my workflow to start. Now before we do that, if you look at this particular section, this is where I have to define the different actions. So first of all, my very first action is going to be a trigger type of action. Now to define a trigger type of action, as you can see that this is a very first step, which is going to be my trigger, as it is also given here. Added a text that you have to use a trigger type. So for each actions in Microsoft Azure Logic App, you have the operation or the connection library available, or the connector library available, which is categorized into 2 sections. You have a built-in section. So as we discussed earlier, built-in sections are the connectors which are provided by Microsoft Azure to support the logic app. They do not have the incur cost available, so you don't your logic app will not have to incur additional cost if you use the built-in connectors. But on top of that, there are some other Azure connector, hundreds of Azure connectors available, which you can utilize to design your workflow, which you can find it here at the Azure section. If I open or click here in the Azure section, it will take a little bit of time to load all the connectors. If I'll just expand that, and you can see that the list or the scroll bar goes on and on. You have hundreds of different connectors which are available, which you can use depending upon your requirement. So these Azure connectors which are given, if you use any of these, it will require its own kind of a configuration. And then whenever your logic app will process the data or uses this connection, you are going to be, your account will be charged to that particular connection to be used. Okay, now this entire section is divided into two different parts. At the top part, we have the different connector, which is built-in and Azure, and at the bottom you have the trigger and different actions. So the connector which you are choosing, no matter whether it is a built-in or Azure type, the connector can be possibly two type. Either it could be a type of trigger, or it could have a trigger type of behavior, or it could be a type of action which you want to plug in or you want to use with that particular connection. So for example, if I use or search recurrence as in text, then that will give me a schedule option which is under the built-in. I can choose a schedule type of connector, and then again when I select a particular connector, as I said, I do have two options. One is trigger and one is action. So at the moment I have within the schedule trigger, I have two different actions, delay and delay until, which I can use, or as this particular case I'll be interested in defining a trigger, because this is my very first step. So I'll be using this particular trigger type, which is a recurrence trigger type. And as I said, each connector would have their own configuration behavior. This recurrence trigger has this many parameters, which is the first one is the interval on which this recurrence should trigger, and then the frequency of that trigger type. So by default the frequency is defined as in the seconds, but it is a drop down which you can change. Do you want to change or run it on every 15 seconds, 15 minutes, hours, days, weeks, months? So you can change it, or if you want you can define a custom values as well with the help of built-in functions. So I'll be leaving this as in second because I want to utilize this want to run it every 15 seconds. Next you have additional parameters, again specific to this particular recurrence type of connector. You do have option to choose a time zone or the start time. If you would like to start this recurrence trigger after certain period of time, or let's say after 10 o'clock this should be started and it should run every 15 seconds, then you can use these particular parameters. And I'm not using that because I would like to start my trigger immediately as soon as I save the connector, and it should keep on running every 15 minutes or so, 15 seconds or so. Next you can see that we have the plus button here which says that insert a new step or the follow-up step after this trigger. So I can click here and add a new action. Add new action. Again it will go to the right hand side connector box where I can define what would be my connector box. For example, in this case I might want to define some of the variables. So let's choose a variable. Here in this case I'm not going to use any triggers because variable by nature, a variable type of connector is not a trigger type. There is no trigger as such available with the variable type. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use or choose a specific actions to my variable type. Now here we have the options like initialize a variable, set a variable, increment, decrement variable, or append to a string variable, for example. So I'll be using initialize variable. So again, as I said, each different connector would have their own set of configuration, which you find it generally under the parameter section. Now here with the parameter section, I can define the name of my variable. So let's say I call it as a run ID, and then next I have to define a type of the parameter. As I've given the name as an str, so I presume that I would like to give the name of my variable as in string type. So as you can see that the type as in the type as in the drop down, and these are the number of different types are supported with the logicapp variable type of connector. So in this case I'll be using the string type of variable. If you would like to give an initial value, you can give it initial value. If you don't want, you can skip that because you can see that there is no asterisk sign, so it's not mandatory. So I'll be using as is. Now if each connector would have 4 different tabs, let's take a moment and discuss about these tabs. So first of all, we have the parameters where we define the behavior of a specific connector or specific action type. So and the next tab you have the settings tab. So each of them would have their own different configuration or the settings type which you may want to configure. For example, here I can define the different tracked keys which is related to this particular variable size. I don't know what exactly it does, but it doesn't make any sense for me to use any of these settings as of now. But you may want to look at the options available under the settings for the connectors which we are using. Sometimes it might possibly find some of the helpful information which is available with the connector which you may want to use in your implementation. So do make sure that you use this particular settings option while just go through with this particular settings option while you are defining or using any of the actions. Next, you have the code view. So whichever connector which we are using right now, let's say in this case initialize variable which we have used right now, so the same JSON implementation is been automatically coded. So you have just UI from the user interface point of view, you have added this particular connector or the action, and then Azure portal or the Azure LogicApp has automatically added a JSON representation code for that particular connector. And then the last tab you have is about. So you can see the definition of or the type of values of that particular connector, and at the top you can see that the default name for that particular action is given, which you can of course you can change the default name. So let's say I can say run ID, that's it. And next, of course, you can save it. Let's save that. That's it. Now I can add another action. So let's add another action. Again, same concept. I can see that I have the option to read, or I have different option to choose as in built-in connector. So what I'll do is this time I'll be using storage account connector, possibly storage blob connector, for example. And let's say we'll see that as soon as get the list all the files or read all the files which are available in the storage account. So list all the container, upload or read blob content from Azure storage, for example. Here, of course, this connector would require the connections. I need to create a connection in order to use this particular connector. So if I do not have connections already created, then this will ask me to create a connection. So as we are using a blob storage, and I have to specify the storage account connection string, which I'll be using an existing storage account which we have. So let's go to these all services, open storage account, access key, connection string, copy, storage connection. This is the name I have given for my key. Next, I'll copy and paste, and that will create a connection. Now it will ask me for the container name from where I want to read the file. So I'll do one thing. I'll create a test container. I'll upload a file here. Let me see if I have any files available. So let's say I'll upload this particular JSON file. JSON file is uploaded. Now let's come back to the container. Here it is asking to add a container name. So I can do one thing. I can provide the container name like this as in text, but I can also set the container name as in expression if I would like to do some kind of expression as well. Or alternative, the best way is to define such kind of a configuration as in parameter. So what I can do is I can create a parameter, let's say container name, and then again choose a type of the parameter, and of course in this case is the test. So I'll be using the test as in container name. I can come back to this section. I can say that the parameter which we have defined just now is available here for use, and I can select that particular parameter. So we have seen that how do you use the parameters with the logic app. Next, you can see that the name of the blob which you want to read. So you can give it a name of your blob, and in this case I'll be using the blob name. Again, I'll go to the parameter. I'll define another parameter which I'll say blob underscore or dash name, which is again going to be type of string. I'll be pasting that particular blob name. Just a moment, let me see if I've copied that. I'll be using that, paste, that's it, done. I'll come back again, and this time I'll be using the second parameter, which is a blob name. I'll save that, and I'll use that another connector, which is my last connector here, and I'll be using as the output, which is a data operation type. And again, the data operation do not have any trigger because we just want to perform a data operation. Let's say I'll be selecting compose data. So what I'm going to do is compose requires the output parameters, which I can define the output. So what exactly I would like to set as an output. So you can see that the parameters, variables, and other options are automatically getting added. So now if you see that these are the two parameters which we have added, this is a variables which we have declared here, and then as we have used the blob action or the blob connector, Azure storage blob connector, so all the properties or the output properties of related to the blob content, read blob content connector is automatically available. So these are the different options which I have as an output, which I can use in my subsequent actions. So for example, it might possible that I would like to print the creation time of a blob, or the property of the blob, or the MD type content of the blob, or the entire content of the blob. For example, let's say I want to set the entire content of the blob as in the compose variable, so I can say that my output, something like that. Now if you have look at carefully, all these actions are generally basically getting added one after other, right? So this is basically doing nothing, it is just setting up a dependency. But it might possible I want to, and what does it means that these action will only run if their previous actions is successfully completed, and that's why it is setting up a dependency. But now I do have option to basically set up another configuration. For example, there is another configuration on this particular connector. There is this settings name is run after. So what I can do is I can click here on the run after, and then I can see the options available with the run after configuration. So what options I have, by default it says that run after a previous one is succeeded, which is this one. But I can also say that run after even though if it is failed. So I do have option to choose that as well. So if I choose that, you can see that these signals are getting changed, and now I can mouse over here and I can see that what does it means. The green means that it will run if it is successful. The red means even though it runs, even if the previous step gets failed as well. Now let me just undo that because I don't want to run and I know it's not going to fail. Similarly, you will find the same settings to the other option as well. This is another way you can set up. Let me save that, and you can see that our workflow is successfully saved. We'll go to the overview. So if you look at the workflows here, it is running every 15 seconds, and this is how you can check from the history. So I'm on the overview, and you have the run history and you have the trigger history as well. So with the run history, you can see that what all different steps or what are the different historical run which has been performed on this particular workflow. And as per our configuration, our workflow is currently running each and every section. Now if I just open that, it will just have a simple run. It's just running a trigger, and this green check means it has successfully run this particular step. Next step is also successfully run. The last one which we have saved is actually failed. So let's look at why exactly it is failed. I can open that workflow which is failed, and it will show the history. And as I said, as we are using the stateful workflow, so this entire workflow journey is getting saved into this storage account. as in the overall run workflow run. It's failing as it's not able to find the parameter name blob name. The workflow parameter blob name is not found. Let's go back to our parameter section and see if we do have the parameters defined or not. Blob name. So I have updated the blob name parameter. Let's see if we rerun again how it works. Now this time it has succeeded. If I open that, so last time somehow it has not saved the parameters, but now if I look at the successful run, it has triggered on this particular time, as you can see. Next, it has set up a default variable value which we are not using, unfortunately. Next, it's trying to read my JSON. So this is the JSON output. So it has used the connector, and you can see that it has read all the JSON content, and the same it is basically passing as an input to the next output compose connector, and then we are generating that as an output as well. Now this is successfully a very simplistic workflow which we have created, which we have defined. Now if you look at some of the other things such as the connections which we have defined, so you can find all those connections which we have added, such as in this case we have added a connection as in the blob storage. So if I just refresh this, it should be available, or I can find it here in the JSON representation view. Sometimes the connection do not get loaded immediately on the UI. I think this is a bug, or it works, sometimes it works slow, but and anyways you can get the connection details as in JSON form which we have created. So as you can see that we have created the connection JSON here, and the connection string itself is added to the app settings, and the way it retrieves the app setting is it uses at sign and then uses the app setting as the keyword to read any of the app setting value. In this case it's reading the connection string value from the app setting. Next you have the parameters which you can use, or you can update the parameter right here from this particular section. And then if I go back to the configuration section, you will find the storage account connection string as the connector value, which is automatically gets added. As you can see that the Azure blob connection string which is getting used, which we have used, which we are using in our connector, is getting added here. Just to summarize, in the workflow we have learned how do you add the different trigger option, how do you define the different steps, actions, what are the different layout behavior looks like for each and every actions, how do you add the sequential action within the workflow, and how do you investigate any success or the failures with the history of the workflow run. In our next videos we'll be discussing some of the complex scenarios with the workflows. We'll be adding or using some of the business use case scenarios to discover or to write our own workflows within the LogicApp as an integration workflow. I hope you have found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.